Welcome to Season 3 of the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Last year, host Jorden Guth got a crash course in the fundamentals of hi-fi from enthusiasts, journalists, manufacturers, and music industry professionals alike. And those lessons will continue, but this year, Jorden will also get a history lesson from the legends who were there from the giddy-up and who made hi-fi what it is today. So with that out of the way, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Today we have Dr. Sean Olive with us, who is currently a senior fellow at Harman International after spending over 22 years as the director of acoustic research at the company, as well as a past president of the Audio Engineering Society. Welcome, Sean.
Hello, how are you, Jorden?
I am very, very good. And I'm really excited to kind of talk to you about all things related to not only your time at the NRC, but also your time in beautiful California and the Harman curves and all that other fun stuff. But I guess to kind of get started, is there like a moment in your history that you can identify as when you first became interested in hi-fi or audio? Do you have like a spark of inspiration type moment for how you kind of started the path that led you to where you are?
Sure. Well, I started out as a musician. I started playing piano when I was 8 years old, and that eventually led to me going to the University of Toronto. I was studying music, but I made the choice of living in a private residence, and I was living with mostly engineers. You know, this was ancient history, right? We're talking 1978. So every person in that residence had their own stereo. And a lot of the engineers were building their own speakers. They were building their own amplifiers. So I naturally became interested. A lot of the conversation was around stereo, speakers, amplifiers. And of course, we were spending all of our money on records. So it was living with all these engineers that I became aware that there were differences in sound quality between different speakers, different recordings. And that kind of kept with me all through my 4 years. And then there was an experience in my final year. I was a piano major and I had to do a recital. And I did my recital. And at the end of the recital, I was handed a cassette tape of my performance. And I went home and listened to it in my dorm. And it was the worst recording I had ever heard. And it turned out they put the microphone underneath the piano. So
Okay.
you were hearing mostly bass, my left hand, and you could hear hardly any you couldn't hear my right hand. So it was just boom, 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 boom for like 30 minutes.
No way.
And then I had another incident where I took a course in jazz orchestration, and this was back when you had to write out all your parts. There was no computers, no automated transcription of parts, and they made a recording of the orchestration with the jazz band, and it was awful. So I said, I'm going to go into sound recording and figure out how to make better recordings. So that's when I made the transition from musician to recording engineer.
Do you still play piano to this day? Or is that kind of a distant past?
Yeah, it's kind of a distant past, but it's always underneath the surface. And I hope maybe when I retire, I'm going to purchase a piano, like a real piano, an acoustic piano, and start playing it again. Because I've kind of gone through this whole circle of confusion within the audio chain, where I started out as a musician, a recording engineer, and then a scientist in sound reproduction. So it would make sense that I've come full circle, and if I started over again, maybe it would be a complete cycle.
Yeah, with all the information and kind of getting back to the basics. I love it.
Right.
Now, you're also a Tonmeister, and this was from McGill as opposed to U of T. Can you explain, one, what is a Tonmeister? What's the idea behind it? And why you decided to go that path as well?
Yeah, well, Tonmeister comes from the German word master of tone. Meister is master and tone is sound, I guess. And it was a program started over in Germany. And the idea is you're a musician first, and then you study engineering and electroacoustics and acoustics, and you master the the art and I guess science of recording. So it was kind of a unique thing. And in 1979, I believe, there was this Polish Tonmeister who was recruited by a professor of music at McGill. His name, he was just a young student. His name was Wesly Waszek. And he came over from Poland. I guess he made a stop in New York. He was making recordings in America, but he came to McGill and started this program in 1979, and I joined the program in 1982. So I was one of the first, I think I was probably in the first 10 graduates of that program. And it's a master's program, and you basically, for 2 years, you take theory of recording, you take electroacoustics, psychoacoustics, some physics courses, some math, and at the end of it, you're qualified, I guess, to make recordings. And there's a strong focus on classical, but you also do jazz and pop. And so that's what I was doing from after studying music to Tonmeister.
So was that effectively your master's degree?
Yeah, it's a master's in sound recording.
And then you also hold a PhD. You are a doctor. Was that before or after? How does this kind of align with you learning about and kind of moving to Ottawa and jumping into the NRC?
Well, that's a whole story in itself. So in the master's program, at that time, you had to do a thesis, and most students had trouble completing that. So there's a lot of Tonmeisters out there that never completed their degree because they got stuck on the thesis part, and they started working and making recordings. So what happened was my final year, Wieslaw took us to the National Research Council on a field trip. And I met Floyd Toole. This was 1985. And, we spent 3 hours there. We spent the afternoon, and Floyd was doing these listening tests, double-blind listening tests on loudspeakers. We went over to the anechoic chamber. He showed us how he measured speakers, and we actually participated in a test. And for me, it was a revelation. I was just completely blown away, because one of my frustrations as a Tonmeister was that, we had speakers in our control room that were actually designed by Floyd, and they had electronic crossovers. And people in the studio would always start playing with the controls of these speakers. They weren't supposed to, but they would go into the control room and start tweaking the knobs. And this was a great frustration to me, because I said, why are you doing that? Those are monitors, and they're supposed to be calibrated and fixed, and you're only supposed to be tweaking the buttons on the mixing console or changing the microphones. So already there was this question within the recording industry that these monitors are not right, and let's change them. So they were using monitors as part of the tools of recording when they should have been just left alone. The other thing they would do is, listen through Yamaha NS10s. They were listening through Ortones. They would make a cassette and play it through their car speakers. And, this was my first experience with a whole circle of confusion, where the monitors are unknown variables, and recording engineers are tweaking the recordings to sound good over unquantified monitors. So when I met Floyd, bringing science to the whole circle of confusion was a revelation. And at that point, I decided I really liked this whole science part of it.
Did you then go to do your PhD, and part of that PhD was working at the NRC?
Yeah. So what happened? I called him up when I got back to Montreal, and I told him that I had to do a thesis, and I'd read it. And I remember it was the most nervous phone call, because I was pretty shy back then, and to call someone up and ask if I could work there but anyways, he said sure. So I went there for the summer, and I was supposed to stay there just for the summer, finish my research, and I ended up spending 7 years there. I finished I did some experiments in the anechoic chamber. I did I simulated a pair of first order reflections and did some listening experiments using speakers with time delays and equalizers. And I finished that, and then I graduated, and I ended up, I guess I was doing such useful work that I got hired as a researcher and spent 7 years. So after 7 years, I went to Harman in 1993. Floyd had been hired there in 1991, and I actually went back and did my PhD at the age of 40.
No way.
Yeah, I did it at McGill. I did it mostly remotely over a course of six or 7 years. And Harman actually paid for it. So I was working full time. I had just gotten married. I had 2 kids, age 1, and one was born, I think, the year I started the PhD. And I was working a full-time job, raising kids and doing the PhD all at the same time.
That is wild.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
But it was, I said Harman paid for the PhD, but the PhD tuition, I think back then at McGill was under $2,000. So Canada is a great place to get an education, particularly if you're Canadian. But even if you're not Canadian, the cost of education there is still half the price of what a private university would be in the United States. So I have Canada, a lot to thank for Canada for giving me a good education that I could actually afford.
A large part of, Floyd Toole and all these other folks, Paul Barton we spoke to as well, Ian Calhoun, like all of these folks owe a lot of their business success and a lot of the development of knowledge of speakers and audio in general to the efforts of the NRC, the National Research Council of Canada. How did, when you started there, this wasn't the inception of Project Athena. You were there before Project Athena, or kind of how did that come about, and what were those timelines like?
So yeah, like I said, I started in 1985. At that time, it was just myself and Floyd. And of course, there were some people that worked there. And initially, I was actually not being paid. I was a volunteer intern, and at some point, Floyd started feeling guilty because I was doing useful work. And he said, so thank God for that. That allowed me to stay there 7 years. But what happened was at some point, I was sponsored by some of the names you mentioned for a year at a time. So I was on the payroll of PSB for a year. I was on the payroll of Paradigm. I was on the payroll of API, which was Audio Products International, Ian Paisley, who made these speakers called Energy. And the Energy 22 was one of the loudspeakers that would consistently win these listening tests. It was an amazing speaker in its day. And then at some point, the conservative government was putting pressure on funding the NRC, and there was this political desire to start making NRC more commercially viable. In other words, doing research that directly benefited the Canadian industry. So Floyd, thankfully, was already doing that. He was, people were coming from speaker companies and using it, and he was teaching them how to design better speakers. And I think around 1988, the Athena project was formed. I could be within a year or two. But and then at some point, Peter Shook was hired. He just graduated from the University of Waterloo with a PhD in math, and he was the first person to join us. And one of his first tasks was writing software for a measurement system, because prior to that, the measurement system ran on a PDB-11, and no one under the age of 30 knew how to program it. And the guy who programmed it was about to retire, so he completely modernized our measurement system, and we got a digital analyzer, which was made by a Montreal company called Amber. And then slowly the Athena project was formed, and various companies were part of that consortium. PSB, Paradigm, State of the Art Electronics. I think Ian Cahoon at Axiom was a partner. Yep. And I think Brightest was for a year or two also a partner. So it was, at that point, we started hiring more people for the project, and it went into full bore.
We've spoken to a lot of the different folks that have been involved with the Athena project. And one of the kind of cool things that I think about is everyone talks about the community of these effectively competitors coming together and building off the research that was going on to then have commercial success. So technically the government met their objective in kind of commercializing research. At the time, did you have a sense of how valuable the stuff that you were doing was? Or was this more like, did you think that this was going to be a niche thing? Did you think that this would apply to all speakers made throughout the world? Or was this more of like kind of a very focused effort?
Yeah, I mean, I had an inkling that what we were doing was useful beyond this community and beyond Canada, because we had people coming to NRC to test their speakers. For a period of time, I was actually employed, not full time, but as a consultant to measure speakers for THX.
Oh, cool.
So I was measuring speakers sent to me by Tom Holman, who sort of started THX, to measure them at NRC. And that would, based on the measurements, that would qualify whether they were certified for THX.
Very cool.
We had people from Snell, Kevin Vicks, who was sort of transitioned, but he was working at Mirage and then he went to Snell, but he was flying from California to measure speakers. And then we had interest from KEF. Laurie Fincham at the time was at KEF, and he actually provided me the loudspeakers that I used in my master's research to generate all these simulated reflections in rooms. So there was a lot of support just outside of Canada for the research that Floyd was doing.
I find that so fascinating. I absolutely love it.
And one thing. The other thing was that all of this work was published, right? Because we were sponsored by the Canadian government, there was an expectation that everything we do is published. And for that reason, everyone who could access the audio engineering journal could read about this. So there was, we had a big following, and whenever we gave talks at AES, there was always a huge crowd. It was like standing room only, because we were one of the few people at that time that were publishing, research in this field.
People were noticing this research. People were seeing the benefits of it. Is that kind of the idea behind how Floyd got hired from Harman and shipped off to California? And then how he kind of recruited some of the other folks to kind of join him in the exodus to California from Ottawa?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In 1985, 86, Floyd published these two papers that basically summarized the work of, how to do listening tests and then correlating the results of listener preferences with measurements. So those were key papers at the time, and they were published in the journal, and he was getting invited to give talks all over the place. So he became, and I could see this, and I knew, well, it would be good to work for this guy because he's well known and he's a great educator, and I had no promise of any future career, and I couldn't at that time imagine that there was a career in this field. But so I think around 1991, Floyd got a call from a recruiter, and Sidney Harman wanted to apply more science to the practice of designing and testing and engineering loudspeakers. So he was invited down to Harman, and I think it was in Santa Barbara. They had an engineering conference, and he talked something like 2 hours about everything he had learned about loudspeakers at the NRC. And it was attended by all the engineers at Harman. And I guess Sidney Harman even showed up and sat in the front row. And it was clearly successful because he was hired shortly thereafter. And that was 1991.
When you left the NRC, was there still work that you wanted to do there, or was kind of the bulk of stuff already laid out and you were looking for something new to kind of get started? Like, why move to California? Why go to Harman from your perspective?
Yeah, well, there's two reasons. I mean, the work at the Athena project was winding down by 1993, and it became clear that it wasn't going to continue. I mean, the people that were working on it ended up getting hired by, Peter and Mark Bonneville both got hired by Paradigm.
Yeah.
Shortly thereafter. So I knew I wasn't going to have a job, and I wasn't going to get hired probably at NRC because that work was going to be stopped. And there weren't any positions like what I was doing in Canada. So for me, it was just a natural career progression. The other thing was I got the call from Harman. I was kind of waiting around for a job offer from Harman, and I actually got an interview at a competitor company in Chicago, and they flew me down there, and it was about January or February. It was like damn cold. And I remember, and back then I didn't have a car, so I cycled everywhere in Ottawa and took the bus when it was too cold. And I remember waiting for the bus, and it was like 20 below zero, and the bus was late. And I got the call, and so I went to Chicago. I had an interview, and then I called Floyd, and I said, "Well, I have this interview in Chicago," and he said, "Well, come to California for an interview." And when they dropped me off at the airport of Chicago, they took me to another airline. They said, "Well, that's not the airline that we booked for your ticket home." And I said, "Well, I'm not going home. I have another interview." So I went to California, and it was like sunny and warm.
Very different climate.
Yeah, and I remember I went in to the HR guy, and he said, "Well, you're from Canada." I said, "Yeah," and he made me an offer, and I guess I didn't look very impressed. So he says, "Well, those are in Canadian dollars. That's like 20% more." And I said, "Well," and he says, "It's much nicer weather here." So I said, "Well, you can't buy the rent out here is not in Canadian dollars, or it's not Canadian rent prices." So
yeah.
But anyway, so I learned a lesson from that. If you want to recruit good audio engineers, you go up to Canada in about February, and you can, they'll definitely want to come down when it's minus 30 below zero.
It's funny you say that, because Ottawa has a reputation of being called Silicon Valley North,
Mm-hmm.
and Ottawa has a very good tech scene, not even just audio related or NRC related, but related to the past industries that are here. So a lot of engineers and smart folks from Ottawa get recruited and move down to the States for different ventures like that. So
yeah,
you're onto something.
Yeah,
you were the early stage of that.
Yeah. We actually had a company in Ottawa briefly. We purchased a company called QNX.
Okay.
Who made they made
Isn't that BlackBerry now?
Yeah, it eventually became BlackBerry, but at the time it was a real-time operating system that we purchased, thinking we could use this in cars.
Yeah. But BlackBerry bought it out, and I think Ford used it in their original stuff. A friend of mine was actually a developer at Nortel.
Mm-hmm.
After Nortel kind of collapsed, he started working for QNX. I don't know if it was RIM at the time. I don't know who owned it. But speaking of migrating, he
Mm-hmm.
went down to North Carolina with the knowledge I had in QNX and has lived there ever since.
Yeah, no, it's a small world in tech. But But as far as I know, we don't own any Canadian companies currently. But at one time, we had an office in Vancouver, and I went to visit them, and it was so beautiful there. You could see the mountains and the ocean, and I just dreamed of moving to Vancouver and working there.
Yeah, beautiful place. For right now, let's go ahead and take a quick break. And when we get back, I'd love to kind of talk to you about how your work kind of started at Harman and where that went to and how that leads up to where you are today.
Sure.
And welcome back. We are here with Dr. Sean Olive. Before the break, we were talking about his time in Canada as he went through university and the NRC and kind of starting up his journey in audio research. And we kind of spoke a little bit about how he migrated down south to California and started working for Harman. Sean, once you got to California, once you started with Harman, day one, what was the kind of, these are your orders, go out and do this from Harman? What were they looking for you to kind of really start work on?
Yeah, well, my first job title was Manager of Subjective Evaluation. So I'd never heard of a title like that before, but people didn't know exactly what it was. Was I judging the looks of the speaker, the feel of the wood? But it was actually evaluating the sound quality. And at that point, Harman had, the idea of a blind test was foreign to them. And immediately I felt this sense of that I wasn't very popular because for many years, engineers had designed these speakers, and the final sound quality was determined by the engineer listening to a prototype in a room with the product manager, and the two of them would basically decide whether the product was ready for production. And the notion that some guy from Canada was coming down to basically tell them whether their speaker was good or not was very intimidating. And so I had I had this feeling that I was always looking over my shoulder when I was walking down the hall or going out at night. But anyway, so I had, and then the other argument was that they said, well, we're professionals. We don't need to do blind tests because we're not biased. We're completely capable of making objective assessments of how the product sounds. So I basically had to do a test to prove that they were not all Dr. Spocks in control of their emotions, that they were actually human and prone to biases. And obviously, I knew how hard it was to be objective because I sort of dabbled in designing crossovers and speakers, and it was always difficult to assess my own work. It was hard to be objective. So I did this test where we tested 4 speakers blind, and then we tested them sighted, and we got completely different results. And Floyd and I published this paper, and it immediately became, it kind of went viral because it showed that if you do sighted tests, you get different results. And at the time, there was always this notion that if you do a sighted test, you always get these huge differences. And then when you do it blind, the differences kind of disappear or get smaller. And this test actually showed the opposite, that when you do the test blind, the speakers, at that time, we didn't have a speaker mover, so they were all in different positions. And the scores would change as you move the speakers around. I mean, we'd already proven this at NRC in the Athena project. We showed that positional effects are real, and sometimes they can be larger than the differences between the speakers themselves. And you could change the music, you could change the positions, and the scores would vary. And then when you did the test cited, these positional effects, the music effects, they all disappear because people can see it's the same speaker and they keep giving it the same score. So they're not actually responding to real acoustic differences because their biases and the visual cues overwhelm anything that they're hearing. And so the results of these tests were that the big expensive JBL speakers, the scores went up when the engineers could see them. And when we threw in a very, very inexpensive speaker, it was JBL Sound Effects, which was our first home theater in a box. It was a little tiny plastic speaker with a subwoofer. And when the engineers saw that inexpensive, cheap product with small drivers, the scores went down. So from that point on, engineers, from that day, they realized they were human and prone to biases, and we never did any cited tests after that.
You started to get along with them a lot more.
Yeah, they started to trust the results, and when they saw that the listeners were in the blind tests were choosing the best speakers, both technically, we were doing measurements at that time, very similar to NRC. That was also a new thing at Harman. They were doing all kinds of different measurements. Every engineer would measure the speaker differently. Some of them were measuring it in the room. Some of them were measuring it in the chamber. The notion of measuring far off axis was new to them. So doing 70 measurements was totally foreign to them. So as we started to show there was this correlation, they started to trust the measurements, they started to trust the process. And for marketing folks and product managers, it was kind of a sense of relief because the pressure was no longer on them as individuals to decide whether a speaker sounded good. It was out of their hands, and it was science that was deciding whether it was ready for production.
Now, you mentioned that when you were doing that test with the engineers to begin with, the smaller, kind of cheaper plastic speakers, the home theater in the box, actually they had the bias. Did that also outperform the larger ones in the?
No, not okay. In this case. They didn't outperform them, but they definitely scored higher when they were cited when they couldn't see it.
Gotcha. I was wondering if they happened to stumble upon some of the kind of pros or the things that made them sound better just by happenstance without actually doing the research. No. The other thing we kind of added to this test was we had the two expensive speakers were $5,000 JBL TI 5000s. And these, at the time, they were one of the most expensive speakers we made. And there was two versions of it. One was a German version that had been voiced in Germany, allegedly for German tastes. So, and then the other one was voiced in Denmark for Northern European tastes. And the speakers had identical drivers, identical except the crossover was slightly more complicated in the German version. And so there was this notion back then that there were different tastes depending on where you lived, what country you lived in, what culture. And this test, we had Germans come in and evaluate it. And at the end of the day, the differences were not statistically significant. So there was no evidence that this German speaker was any better. And we stopped making the German speaker because it was very expensive to make two different speakers that were otherwise statistically insignificant in a listening test. I find that so interesting. Ian Calhoun was talking about that as well, how previous to a lot of the NRC research, there was this idea of a British sound and this idea of a German sound and all of these different characteristics of a speaker. And the NRC research, and by the sounds of it, also when you reaffirmed it at Harman, it just became, these are generally what make speakers in general sound good.
Yeah.
There's not a specific region or culture that has preferences vastly different from others.
No, and this is just one case, but we've done similar tests to show that the Japanese people prefer as much bass as Americans, because there was a situation where Lexus thought that our cars needed to be tuned differently in Japan. So we went to Tokyo and did a large study, and it showed that Japanese people like the same amount of bass as Americans. The main difference, I believe, is that when they go home, they tend to live in very high density housing with neighbors on top of each other. And we know from sales that they don't buy subwoofers. And we believe it's very contextual and very social. So when they're at home, they don't like a lot of bass because they don't want to disturb their neighbors. And but in their cars and in theaters, they like to hear bass. So it's a social cultural thing that's very contextual. And in the United States, we don't really give a damn about our neighbors.
There's much less consideration, that's for sure.
Yes, we all carry guns with us. So if they come over to complain, they're not going to complain, right?
And as you kind of start doing this research and start exploring loudspeakers at Harman, how did that transition into headphones and in-ear monitors and all of that stuff?
Yeah, so that was very interesting. Around 2012, we could see that headphone sales were taking off because of the iPod, the iPhone, and the transition of music from CD, physical media, to streaming. So all of a sudden, people were carrying around, 1,000 songs in their pocket, and they needed some way to listen to it. So headphones were in high demand. And, at that time, Harman didn't make headphones with the exception of AKG, which mostly focused on professional headphones for monitoring. And we were kind of late to the game. Beats figured this out very quickly. They were on top of it, probably because they had a connection to the music industry, Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine, and they could see this happening in real time. So they, at that time, Beats had a 50% market share, and for headphones costing over $200, and this was a whole new category. So Todd Welty and I started measuring headphones, and we could see that it was like the loudspeakers back in the 70s. They were all over the map. There was no consistency. There was no, even within a brand, there was no consistency. And we looked at the literature, and we saw that headphones, there hadn't been any research done really since the 80s. The current international standard was the diffuse field calibration, which goes back to 1993, and hardly anyone was following it. So we could see that there was a real need for some scientific guidance. So we started doing research in headphones.
And with that research, you effectively came to the conclusion or the result of the Harman target curve.
Yeah. So we looked at the diffuse field curve, and it's basically if you were to go into a reverberation chamber and measure a flat speaker at the eardrum, that would be the diffuse field curve. And just the logic of that didn't seem to make sense, because we listened to loudspeakers in rooms, and it's in no way similar to a diffuse field. You get a very strong direct sound component. You get a few strong early reflections, but then very little late reflections. So the whole notion that we listen to speakers in diffuse fields was false. So we went into our reference room, and we had some anechoically flat loudspeakers, and we measured them with basically a test fixture for headphones. So it's got the ear canal included in it. It's got microphones at the end of the ear canal. And we measured these speakers, and that became the basis of the Harman target curve. And we equalized the speaker to be flat, steady state at the listening position. And that was sort of our baseline. We knew that wouldn't be right, because it would sound thin in the bass, it would sound too bright. And then we had people make adjustments, to the bass and treble. And after they made those adjustments, it very much approximated a neutral speaker in a semi-reflective listening room. And that became the Harman target curve for headphones.
And what was the idea behind kind of publishing the Harman target curve results, making that information widely available as opposed to kind of keeping it proprietary and just using it exclusively for your headphones?
Yeah, so that's a very important question you asked, because that was one of the requirements of me joining Harman, and I think Floyd, one of his requirements. And I was reading something he wrote. Floyd's writing a 4th edition of his book, and I'll be contributing a chapter on headphones, and Todd Welty's writing on subwoofers and rooms. But I was reading through some of his preliminary copy, and he reminded me that when he joined Harman, he said to Sidney Harman, "I want to be able to publish our research just like we did at the NRC." And Sidney Harman said, yes, of course, it will show Harman as a leader in the field, and it's great for marketing and sales. So that is one of the main reasons I've worked at Harman for 31 years, is because we can publish our work, we can be a thought leader. And if I worked for Apple or Google or any other company you can think of, they would just lock you up in a room and you would never be able to publish your work. I was just reading the other day where Apple is now making a move into AI, but they have trouble recruiting leading AI researchers, because they will not allow them to publish their work. And for anyone who's, we're not motivated by money, we're motivated by publishing our work. That's what gives us the motivation, is to be able to share this knowledge. And for me, that's always been the reason to stay at Harman. So to answer your question, it's just in keeping with everything we've done since I joined. And I've experienced pressures sometimes from marketing people who would rather that we didn't publish it.
Yeah.
But now everyone, interestingly enough, in marketing loves the fact that we publish it, because it's become kind of a benchmark or an industry.
You're the reference which people look towards as they do their own thing and kind of put their own products out.
Yeah, some guy recently at a very high level said if you Google Harman target curve, the number of hits is like incredible, and there's nothing else in Harman that generates as many Google hits.
It is funny that you say that, because when I Googled Harman target curve and Harman, I came up with an old website of yours that is the Harman How to Listen app, which, by the way, I would love to use. I need to dig out an old computer to use it, because it does not work on the newer machines. I think the last update was in 2011.
Yeah.
But this kind of, and it goes into what you're saying, and it's really interesting hearing the driving force behind why you do a lot of this stuff is not necessarily just because it's a job, but because you want to figure out what this is all about and then educate people. And just for people that don't know, this How to Listen app is effectively, maybe I'll get you to describe what the idea behind that Harman How to Listen app was or is.
Yeah, I mean, it's an app that we, one of the things we do at Harman is we use trained listeners. So how do you train a listener? So that was one of my early tasks, where we had to teach people how to identify resonances and frequency response aberrations. And it started out with pre-equalizing music, which means you had a limited number of choices and it couldn't easily adapt. And then we used MIDI-controlled equalizers. And then finally, we just started using DSP in the computer that processed the audio, and that allowed you to make it infinitely adaptive to the ability of the listener. But essentially, it's a program that runs on old Windows. No, I think it runs on current Windows, but when Mac went from 32 to 64-bit, it stopped working. So basically it introduces music that has been pre-equalized, and you have, it starts out with two choices. So it could be one of two frequency bands. You select which one you think it is. It tells you whether you're right. And then it gets progressively more and more difficult. It can go all the way up to 24 bands. And you have to, and the bands get narrower and narrower. So you have to identify which frequency band you think is adjusted. And people who are really good at this can get up to 12, 15 bands. And to be a Harman listener, you have to get up to at least 8 bands. And there's other tasks, but that's the one that is probably best known and what people like doing.
Is there a way, is there a new app or a new way that you train your listeners or anyone else that's interested in kind of learning how to listen?
In our group, corporate research, we don't have a current app. We're actually working on an app right now for spatial training.
Oh, cool.
So it's going to be very cool. It involves, you put on a set of VR goggles. You're in a room surrounded by speakers, and we're using some software from a company we just bought called Flux Immersive. And it's an app that was developed by Earcam over in Paris, which is called Spat Revolution. And it basically will allow you to process audio in real time spatially. And so you put on the VR goggle sets, and the sound is steered somewhere in space. You can see a grid of speakers, and you have to use your VR handset to indicate where it is in space. You can change the width of the image. You can change the depth. So that's something we're working on, but we're also thinking of doing a new version of how to listen that would teach you how to identify differences in dynamics and timbre and so on.
I would personally love it. I think that would be super helpful for myself. And I'm sure there's a lot of other people out there that would be curious to kind of learn from the best about how to listen more accurately.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to it because I think there's a huge demand for something that can teach you how to be a better listener.
So Sean, up until this point, we've now kind of talked about, and I know there's a lot more. It's kind of hard to condense 30 plus years of work into kind of an hour episode. What is there that you are interested in exploring going forward, or what do you feel is still kind of a subject that people don't know a lot about, or that you yourself don't know a lot about that you feel more research can be done in?
Yeah, well, clearly immersive audio is the current hot topic and the trend. And I think there's still a lot of questions to be answered about how individualized does it have to be, because we all have different head shapes, different size of ears, and that affects the spatial cues that arrive at our ears. How important is it to use, for example, your own individual HRTFs? So that's something we've been exploring. We've also been exploring, how important is your ear canal on the sound quality and the localization of sound. We all have different sizes and shapes of ear canals, but actually measuring them is challenging. You could measure it if you stick a probe mic down your ear and touch the eardrum and measure it at that point, but that's not really feasible for a consumer product. So that's something we've been exploring. We think that we could improve the experience if we can compensate headphones for your individual ear canals, but we're still working on that. And then finally, everyone is getting older, and as you get older, you get natural hearing loss. And there's this new category of hearable that is sold over the counter. It doesn't cost $5,000 like some hearing aids, and it can help you hear music better if you have slight to moderate hearing loss. And I'm kind of interested in how the target curve changes as a function of your hearing loss.
I know we're running out of time, so I want to ask a question that we tend to ask everyone that comes on, and it is, if there was a soundtrack to your life, or a song or a track that you would listen to out of pure enjoyment or fun, not a program for work or testing, what would that be? Would it be Fast Car by Tracy Chapman?
Yeah, well, it would be the first 20 seconds of Fast Car. Because when I hear that track, those first 20 seconds, I can tell instantly whether the speaker or headphone is any good. I don't need to listen to 20 tracks, but since you're not allowing me that answer, maybe it would be the rest of the song, which I've never heard. No, I don't know. I haven't thought about this question. I should have known you were going to ask me, but my favorite music is probably jazz. There's something about how, because it's improvisational, it's never the same twice, and it's really a free expression of emotion and the artist that I was classically trained, but my love is jazz, and jazz piano with vocal and bass is like that would be my ultimate deserted island music.
If I had to ask you for a song that I could add to my playlist to kind of get that appreciation of jazz, can you give me a song?
Well, there's a song that whenever I hear it, I just stop whatever I'm doing and I just go into this emotional state, and it's probably the Girl from Ipanema.
I love that song.
And when Stan Getz starts playing the alto sax, I just stop what I'm doing. I don't know what it is about the song, but I never grow tired of it, and I can very seldom listen to it just once.
Sean, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate you making the time and joining us today. If people are interested in kind of learning more about your research or keeping up with the research and the publications and maybe want to know as soon as this new How to Listen app comes out and the spatial audio stuff, where can people find you or kind of learn more about you?
Well, I'm pretty active on social media, so Twitter, I think my handle is at Sean Olive on Twitter. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. All of our publications, I usually try to update it. So if you scroll down, you'll see recent papers published on LinkedIn. And I'm also on Facebook. I'm a little more, how can I say, opinionated on Facebook, sometimes a little more political. But those are three places you can find out what I'm up to.
Thank you so much, Sean. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jordan. It's been a pleasure.